Victoria Sterling thought she'd found the perfect entertainment for her charity gala when she invited her boring estate security guard to rub shoulders with Manhattan's elite. She imagined him stammering over caviar, drowning in a sea of designer gowns and tax brackets he'd never understand. But when the ballroom doors opened and he stepped into the golden light, the man who walked in didn't just belong among the billionaires. He made them look like they were the ones who didn't belong. In the glittering world of New York's upper echelon, power is measured in whispers and side glances, where one wrong move can exile you from penthouse cocktail parties forever. To Victoria Sterling, the man who stood watch at her Connecticut estate gate was nothing more than a uniform with a pulse, a prop in her perfectly curated life of marble fountains and morning mimosas. She spoke to him the way one might address a houseplant, with vague acknowledgement and zero expectation of a response. What Victoria didn't know was that the silent man in the standard-issue security jacket had once commanded rooms far more important than her ostentatious ballroom. Behind those steady, unremarkable eyes was a past filled with classified briefings, diplomatic escorts, and handshakes with people who actually changed the world. He'd walked away from that life after a loss too devastating to speak of, choosing the quiet anonymity of night shifts and perimeter checks. But when Victoria handed him an engraved invitation, laughing with her Botoxed friends about how adorable it would be to watch him squirm among real society, something inside him shifted. He'd spent 3 years being invisible, letting entitled voices wash over him like background noise. He'd convinced himself that staying small kept him safe from more pain. Victoria's cruel little game was about to teach her something the wealthy rarely learn, that a man who chooses silence is not the same as a man who has nothing to say. And sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimated. The gates of the Sterling estate opened at exactly 6:47 a.m., the way they had every morning for the past 3 years. Christopher Hayes stood in his small guardhouse, watching the iron bars swing inward with mechanical precision, his coffee still steaming in the cheap ceramic mug he'd bought from a gas station somewhere in New Jersey. The surveillance monitors cast a blue glow across his face as he logged the entry into the system. 1 landscaping truck, 2 workers, Wednesday maintenance schedule. His uniform was pressed. His boots were polished. His jaw was clean-shaven. These were the disciplines that kept him tethered to something resembling purpose, even when purpose felt like a word from a language he'd forgotten how to speak. By 9:15, Victoria Sterling's white Range Rover came gliding down the curved driveway like a yacht entering harbor. Christopher stepped out of the guardhouse, ready to open her gate as he did every weekday morning. She didn't slow down. She never did. The SUV rolled past him close enough that he could smell the leather interior, and through the tinted window, he caught a glimpse of her. Phone pressed to her ear, lips moving rapidly, eyes that looked through him the way you'd look through glass. He radioed to the main house that Mrs. Sterling had departed. No one responded. No one ever did. The hours moved like molasses. Christopher walked the perimeter twice, checked the camera angles on the east lawn, replaced a burned-out bulb on the pathway lights near the tennis courts that Victoria never used. At noon, the housekeeper brought him a sandwich in a plastic container, setting it on the guardhouse counter without a word. He nodded his thanks. She was already walking away. This was his life now. Invisible. Useful. Forgotten. It hadn't always been this way. There had been a time when his presence commanded attention, when his voice carried weight in rooms where nations made promises they'd never keep. But that man had died the same night his fiancée did, burned up in a car accident that the official report called mechanical failure, and that Christopher's instincts called something much darker. He'd walked away from the questions, from the suspicions, from the life that demanded he keep moving forward when all he wanted was to stop. At 6 p.m., Victoria returned. This time she stopped. Her window descended with an electric hum, and she looked at him the way someone might examine a stain on expensive upholstery. "You're still here," she said, as if his presence was somehow negotiable. "I need you to stay late Friday. I'm having people over." "Yes, ma'am," Christopher replied. Her window was already rising before he finished speaking. The Sterling Mansion's West Terrace was a stage for expensive boredom, where women in athleisure that cost more than most people's rent sipped rose and complained about things that weren't actually problems. Victoria held court at the center of a teak table that could seat 12, her fingers wrapped around a glass of whispering angel that she'd pronounced divine at least 3 times before lunch ended. So the event planner wants to do ice sculptures, she was saying, waving her free hand dismissively. I told her absolutely not. We're not catering a sweet 16. Margot Chen laughed, the sound sharp and practiced. What's the theme again? Venetian Masquerade. Venetian Noir, Victoria corrected. There's a difference. It's darker, more mysterious. Black tie mandatory, masks required. Very eyes wide shut, but without the weird sex cult energy. Sounds exhausting, drawled Sloane Whitmore, examining her manicure. Who's coming? Victoria rattled off names like she was reading from Forbes. Hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs, a retired ambassador, the kind of people who measured their worth in influence rather than mere millions. She was midway through describing the champagne selection when her eyes drifted toward the front gate, where Christopher's figure was barely visible through the ornamental hedges. You know what would be hilarious? Victoria said suddenly, her voice taking on that particular tone that preceded her worst ideas. The other women leaned in like conspirators. What if I invited him? Victoria continued, nodding toward the guardhouse. My security guard. To the gala. There was a beat of confused silence before Margot started laughing. You're joking. I'm completely serious. Victoria's smile was spreading like spilled wine. Can you imagine? Him in a tuxedo, trying to make small talk with Senator Bradford, holding a champagne flute with those hands that probably smell like gun oil. Sloane snorted into her rose. He wouldn't come. He's too smart for that. Oh, I could make him come, Victoria said. I'd frame it as a generous gesture. Tell him I appreciate his service, that he deserves to see how the other half lives. Make it sound like charity. Evil, Margot said approvingly. I love it. I'll bet you $1,000 he doesn't show, Sloane offered. No way his ego survives the invitation. I'll take that bet, Victoria replied. In fact, I'll bet he does show. That type always does. They think they're better than they are. He probably has some pathetic rented tuxedo hanging in his closet from a cousin's wedding. The women were giggling now, imagining it. Christopher surrounded by Manhattan's elite, fumbling with oyster forks, mispronouncing Chateau Margaux, standing alone in a corner while the real guests networked and schemed around him. This is going to be the best party ever, Victoria declared, refilling her glass. Forget the ice sculptures. This is the entertainment. Victoria approached the guardhouse on Thursday afternoon with the kind of deliberate stride that suggested she was doing something magnanimous. She'd changed into a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost what Christopher made in a month, and her heels clicked against the stone pathway like a countdown timer. Christopher saw her coming through the window and stepped outside, instinctively straightening his posture. In 3 years, she'd never walked down to the gate. Whatever this was, it wasn't routine. Christopher, she said, his name sounding strange in her mouth, like she'd had to practice it. Do you have a moment? Of course, Mrs. Sterling. She held an envelope between 2 fingers, cream-colored to match her outfit, the kind of heavy cardstock that announced its own importance. I'm hosting a charity gala Friday evening. Very exclusive. Some of the most influential people in New York will be attending. She paused, letting that information settle like dust. I've been thinking about how hard you work, standing out here in all weather, keeping us safe. It occurred to me that you never get to see the world you're protecting. Christopher took the envelope she was extending toward him. His name was written across the front in calligraphy so elaborate it was nearly illegible. I'd like you to attend, Victoria continued. As my guest, consider it a gesture of appreciation. You'll get to experience an evening among real society. See how the other half lives, so to speak. Her smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Christopher had seen smiles like that before, in negotiation rooms where people smiled right before they destroyed you. That's very generous, Mrs. Sterling, he said carefully. It's black tie, of course. Masquerade theme. I'm sure you can find something appropriate to wear. There are rental places in town, I think. The kind that cater to proms and weddings. She said it like she was being helpful, but the subtext was clear. I know you don't own a tuxedo. I know you'll look ridiculous trying to pretend you do. I understand you'll still need to work that evening, she added. But the party starts at 8. Once the guests are all inside and settled, you're welcome to join us. Think of it as clocking out and clocking into a different kind of evening. Christopher turned the envelope over in his hands. He could feel the weight of expectation in it, the cruelty disguised as kindness. "There's no pressure, of course," Victoria said, already turning to walk back toward the house. "But it would be such a shame if you missed it. You might never get another opportunity like this." She glanced back over her shoulder. After all, guard dogs usually stay outside during the party, don't they? She was laughing softly as she walked away, the sound carrying on the afternoon breeze like poison. Christopher drove to the storage facility in Stamford Saturday morning, the invitation still sitting on his passenger seat like evidence of a crime not yet committed. He'd been avoiding this place for 3 years, paying the monthly fee automatically, pretending the unit didn't exist, pretending the man who'd filled it didn't exist either. The lock resisted at first, corroded from disuse, but finally gave way with a metallic groan. He pulled up the rolling door and stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness inside. Boxes, plastic containers, a life compressed into 10 by 10 feet of concrete and regret. He pulled the chain on the overhead bulb and started opening containers. The first held books, operational manuals, diplomatic protocols, a signed first edition of a memoir by a Secretary of State he'd once protected for 6 months in Kabul. The second contained photographs he couldn't look at yet. The third held his uniforms. Not security guard polyester. The real ones. Dress blues with ribbons he'd earned in places whose names were still classified. A State Department credential with a younger version of his face staring back at him, eyes that still believed in things. Letters of commendation on official letterhead, signed by people who appeared on currency. At the bottom of the fourth box, wrapped in tissue paper like a relic, he found the tuxedo. Custom-made by a tailor in Georgetown for a state dinner he'd attended not as security, but as a guest, back when his expertise was valued enough to warrant a seat at tables where decisions got made. The fabric was midnight blue, cut with a precision that spoke to craftsmanship from an era before fast fashion. He lifted it out carefully, expecting moths or mildew, but it was perfect. Waiting. Christopher sat down on a box of old files and stared at the tuxedo draped across his lap. For 3 years he'd chosen invisibility, chosen silence, chosen to let people like Victoria Sterling reduce him to a function rather than a person. He'd told himself it was peace, this erasure of self. But it wasn't peace. It was cowardice. The man who'd owned this tuxedo wouldn't have tolerated being someone's punchline, wouldn't have accepted cruelty disguised as charity. That man had walked into rooms that mattered and made people listen. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from who he used to be. Christopher stood up, the tuxedo folded carefully over his arm, and walked back toward the light. The tailor shop on Madison Avenue looked like it had been transplanted from another century, all dark wood paneling and brass fixtures that gleamed under soft lighting. Christopher pushed through the door, a small bell announcing his arrival, and was immediately greeted by the scent of wool and leather and money. An elderly man emerged from the back, glasses perched on his nose, tape measure draped around his neck like a ceremonial sash. He glanced up at Christopher with the professional disinterest of someone who'd seen every type of customer, then froze mid-step. "My God," the man said softly. "Christopher Hayes." Christopher felt something shift in his chest. "Mr. Castellano." "I thought you were dead," Castellano said, closing the distance between them. "Or disappeared." The rumors were everywhere. State Department wouldn't confirm or deny anything. He was studying Christopher's face like he was reading a map. "What happened to you?" "I needed to disappear for a while," Christopher replied. "Still do, actually. I just need to reappear for one night." He laid the midnight blue tuxedo across the counter. Castellano touched the fabric with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend. "I remember making this," he said. "Spring of 2019. You were escorting the undersecretary to that G7 dinner. You told me you needed something that could hide a weapon but look like it belonged in a ballroom. I need you to make sure it still fits." Castellano gestured toward the back. "Come, let's see what 3 years of exile has done to you." While Christopher stood on the platform being measured and pinned, Castellano worked in focused silence, occasionally shaking his head. "You're harder now," he finally said. "Leaner. Whatever you've been doing, it wasn't sitting behind a desk." He stepped back, examining his work. This will be ready by Friday afternoon. You'll look like you never left. That's exactly what I need." 20 blocks away, Victoria Sterling sat at her vanity, rehearsing her lines in the mirror. She'd written them out like a comedy routine, little jabs wrapped in false sweetness that her guests would find delightful. "And we're so honored to have Christopher joining us tonight, all the way from the guardhouse. Christopher, tell us, do you prefer champagne or beer?" "Oh, they're both in glasses. How confusing for you." She laughed at her own wit, imagining the polite chuckles from her guests, the way Christopher would stand there stammering, realizing too late that he'd walked into an ambush. Margot had texted earlier, "Is he really coming? I can't wait to see this." Victoria typed back, "Oh, he'll come. His type always does. They think one invitation means they've made it. By the end of the night, he'll know exactly where he belongs." She smiled at her reflection, practicing the expression she'd wear when he arrived. Gracious, condescending, triumphant. The Sterling mansion had been transformed into something from a fever dream of wealth. Hundreds of candles flickering in crystal holders, black silk draped across every surface, a string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner like they were summoning spirits. The guests moved through the ballroom in elaborate masks, their identities hidden but their net worth unmistakable in the cut of their clothes and the confidence of their laughter. Victoria stood at the center of it all in a crimson gown and a gold mask shaped like a phoenix, holding court with a senator's wife and a venture capitalist whose company had just gone public. She'd been checking the entrance every few minutes, waiting for Christopher to slink in wearing something ill-fitting and apologetic. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Maybe he'd lost his nerve. Then the crowd shifted. It started as a ripple, heads turning toward the entrance in a wave of curiosity. Conversations stuttered and died. The quartet seemed to play softer, as if even the music wanted to hear what happened next. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the foyer's chandelier. He wore midnight blue so dark it was almost black, tailored with a precision that made every other tuxedo in the room look like a compromise. His mask was simple, black silk that covered the upper half of his face, but it only emphasized the sharp line of his jaw and the stillness in his posture that spoke of absolute control. He didn't rush, didn't look around nervously. He simply stood there, surveying the room the way a general might survey a battlefield, and then he walked forward with the kind of measured grace that suggested he'd walked into rooms far more dangerous than this one. Victoria felt her smile freeze. Something was wrong. This wasn't the stammering guard she'd imagined. This was someone else entirely. Margot appeared at her elbow, gripping her arm. "Is that him?" she whispered. Before Victoria could answer, she watched as heads continued to turn. Women stared openly. Men straightened their postures unconsciously, the way people do when confronted with someone who carries authority like a second skin. The mysterious figure accepted a champagne flute from a passing waiter with a nod of acknowledgement, his movements economical and precise. He wasn't trying to blend in. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't need to. He was already the most compelling person in the room, and he hadn't said a single word. Victoria moved through the crowd with purpose, her phoenix mask catching the candlelight as she closed the distance between herself and the figure in midnight blue. She'd planned this moment, rehearsed the reveal like a stage performance. The humiliation would be exquisite. "Everyone," she called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. The quartet stopped playing. Faces turned toward her. "I have a confession to make about our mysterious late arrival." Christopher stood perfectly still, champagne flute balanced in his hand, watching her approach with eyes that revealed nothing behind his mask. "This gentleman," Victoria continued, her smile sharp as broken glass, "is actually my security guard. Christopher works at my front gate. I invited him tonight as a gesture of goodwill, so he could see how the other half lives." She paused for effect, waiting for the gasps, the awkward laughter, the social death she'd orchestrated. Instead, a voice spoke from near the window. "Hayes? Christopher Hayes." An older man stepped forward, silver-haired and distinguished, his own mask pulled up to rest on his forehead. Victoria recognized him vaguely, something to do with military contracts or intelligence, invited by her husband for networking purposes. "Sir," Christopher said, his voice low and controlled, acknowledging the man with a slight nod. "Good God, "We thought you were dead," the man said, moving closer. "The State Department said you'd resigned, but the rumors—" He trailed off, looking Christopher up and down. "What the hell are you doing working as a security guard?" Keeping a low profile, Christopher replied simply. A woman in an emerald gown pushed through the crowd. "Wait, Christopher Hayes? The Christopher Hayes who negotiated the Ankara extraction? My husband still talks about that operation. He said you were the only person in the room who kept his head." "That was classified," Christopher said mildly. "Everything you did was classified," the silver-haired man said, then turned to address the crowd. "This man protected 3 ambassadors, helped prevent a coup in West Africa, and once talked a warlord out of executing a dozen aid workers using nothing but a satellite phone and nerves of steel." Victoria felt the room tilting. This wasn't the script. "He's been working as my guard for 3 years, she said weakly, trying to regain control. "He checks IDs and opens gates." "Then you've been wasting him," a tech mogul said from the back, stepping forward with interest. "Hayes, are you still in the security consulting business? Because I've been looking for someone to head up my executive protection division. Someone with real experience, not just former cops playing dress-up." Christopher's eyes found Victoria's across the room. Behind his mask, she thought she saw the ghost of a smile. "I might be available," he said. "My current position has become somewhat limiting." The tech mogul who'd spoken was Marcus Chun, founder of Sentinel Global, a company that provided security for Fortune 100 executives and handled protection details for people who needed to stay alive in complicated parts of the world. He'd made his first billion before 40 and wore his success like a well-tailored suit. Obvious, but not obnoxious. He approached Christopher with the focused intensity of someone who recognized value when he saw it. "I'm serious about that offer," Marcus said, extending his hand. "I've heard your name in rooms where names don't get spoken lightly. If even half the stories are true, you're exactly what my company needs." Christopher shook his hand, the grip firm and brief. "What kind of partnership are we talking about?" "Executive Vice President of Operations. Full equity stake. You'd oversee all our high-level contracts, build your own team, report directly to me." Marcus pulled out a business card, placing it in Christopher's hand. "The pay would be 7 figures base, not counting bonuses. More importantly, you'd be doing work that matters again instead of—" He glanced toward the entrance, toward the gates beyond, watching driveways. Victoria stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling slightly in her hand. Around her, the guests had formed a loose circle around Christopher and Marcus, drawn to power the way moths were drawn to light. No one was looking at her anymore. Her party, her stage, her carefully constructed social triumph had been hijacked by the man she'd invited as entertainment. Victoria thought she was doing charity work, Sloane whispered to Margot, loud enough for others to hear. Turns out she was employing someone who could buy and sell most of us. Could have employed, Margot corrected. "I don't think he's coming back to that guardhouse." The senator's wife leaned toward her husband. "Didn't you say you needed someone to consult on that security bill? Someone with actual field experience instead of think tank theory." Christopher was suddenly the center of a networking hurricane. Business cards appeared. Invitations were extended. A former ambassador asked if he'd consider private consulting work. A hedge fund manager wanted to discuss personal protection for an upcoming trip to Dubai. Victoria watched her carefully planned humiliation transform into Christopher's coronation. Every insult she'd prepared dissolved like sugar in rain. Every condescending word she'd rehearsed now sat bitter on her tongue, unspoken and useless. Christopher finally looked at her, his expression unreadable behind the mask. "Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Sterling," he said quietly. It was very illuminating. Christopher returned to the guardhouse Monday morning to collect his belongings, but he didn't bother with the uniform. He wore jeans and a black sweater, the clothes of a man who no longer needed to perform subservience for a paycheck. His possessions fit into a single duffel bag, some books, a photo he kept face down, the cheap coffee mug he decided to leave behind as a relic of someone he used to be. Marcus Chin's Mercedes was idling outside the gate, silver and sleek, with Marcus himself behind the wheel. "Thought you might want to ride to the office," he'd texted that morning. "We have paperwork to sign and a team to build." Christopher locked the guardhouse for the last time and walked toward the car without looking back. He didn't know Victoria a resignation letter. Didn't know her an explanation. His absence would be message enough. Inside the main house, Victoria stood at her bedroom window, watching him leave. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes, ever since she'd seen the Mercedes pull up. Her phone had been eerily quiet all weekend. The group chat with Margot and Sloane had gone silent after someone posted a photo from the gala. Christopher surrounded by influential guests, Victoria relegated to the background, out of focus and irrelevant. 3 people had canceled lunch plans. Her event planner had emailed to say she was pursuing other opportunities. Most damning of all, her husband had asked over breakfast why she'd never mentioned that their security guard was that Christopher Hayes, his tone suggesting she'd failed some unspoken test of social intelligence. She watched the Mercedes glide down the driveway, watched Christopher's silhouette through the tinted windows, composed and untouchable. The gate, his former domain, opened automatically, and the car disappeared onto the tree-lined road beyond. The estate felt enormous suddenly. Empty. The silence pressed against her like physical weight. Her phone buzzed finally. A text from Margot. "Did you see the Times business section? Marcus Chin just announced a new VP. Says he's the best hire he's ever made." Below the message was a link. Victoria clicked it despite herself. There was Christopher's photo, professional and commanding, accompanied by a quote from Marcus about bringing legendary expertise to a new generation of security challenges. Victoria set her phone down and stared at the empty guardhouse through the window. She'd wanted to remind him of his place. Instead, she'd reminded him that he'd never belonged there at all.